Thank you for listening to this segment of Indie-stry, where I will be talking with producer Dallas Sonnier behind such films as Bone Tomahawk, Brawl in Cell Block 99, Dragged Across Concrete, The Standoff at Sparrow Creek, and the more recent Run, Hide, Fight. Dallas talks about his history, his upbringing, his company itself, which has been under much scandal this past year, and goes into the idea of giving filmmakers the creative control, talking about unsafe films in order to really challenge people. And we just talk about the future of media in general and where it will be going post-COVID, based on physical media, movie theaters, and so on. It was a really interesting conversation to have, especially during this time, and I think you should have a listen. Enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me, Dallas.
It's great to talk to you. You've been a loyal fan, and I appreciate all the great support you've given me over the years, several emails and notes after seeing my movies, so it's great to talk to you.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. We kind of have had these email exchanges for, 2 years now, and then this is one of the first times, I think the second time that we've actually kind of spoken in person, I guess, as much as we can. So on phone, but
welcome to the new realities of the world.
Yeah. So you are a producer. You have a long history of talent management and producing, and you went back to Dallas, Texas, where you then started up your own company. But I was curious if you'd be willing to kind of talk about just how you started and some of that process leading up until creating your company.
Sure. I had a very traditional American childhood in Dallas, Texas. I went to movies with my parents, and especially my dad. He would let me see pretty much any R-rated movie, or even above, way too young. And I remember there was one time, I must have been 9 years old because I think it came out around that time, but Predator 2 was the movie playing that weekend.
Oh.
And my dad got us tickets, and I had a friend over who couldn't see R-rated movies, and so my dad came up to me and he was like, do you want to go see the movie, or do you want to keep playing with John? And I was like, let's drop John off on the way. and so I think it was just such a great time for movies, and such a great time for sort of a kid growing up. Mm. And I obviously felt very blessed to be able to watch so many great movies with my parents, and especially now having lost them, it's a great sort of nostalgic feeling, the concept of movies and watching movies for me. I'm certainly worried about the movie theaters and the health of the movie theater business, but I'm a movie theater guy and, physical media guy. But, going back, I basically followed the track of so many people saying, I love movies. Is there a job that I could do? I'm not a writer. I'm certainly not a director. Mm-hmm. I'm not an artist. I'm very left-brained, although I have the ability to sort of understand the right brain mentality and can be very helpful in note sessions and, with scripts and with editorials and things like that. But, I went out to USC film school twice, actually. I went first as a high school student and then again as an undergrad. And it was a blast. And I was meeting all these different people in these different walks of life and just really, really enjoying it. And I ended up interning for one of the biggest producers in the world at the time, and still today, named Scott Rudin. And that was wild. I was reading all of these amazing scripts that were coming through his office, really understanding what made up a great script and what was sort of an average script. And he didn't produce Monsters Ball, but I read that script and I thought, this is the best thing I've ever read. And it was just so eye-opening to have access to stuff like that. And then the movies would come out and I'd get to watch them and sort of see what it was like going from script to screen. Eventually, I graduated and I ended up as an assistant at a company called United Talent Agency. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they rep big movie stars and huge directors and stuff like that. So I ended up learning from several great agents there about representation, working with filmmakers and stuff like that, but also deal making, which was so important and continues to be important in my producing career. So eventually, after a couple of years there, I became a manager, first at a company run by someone else, and then I went out on my own in my entourage moment, so to speak, and created my own management company. Really, at the time, our clients were sort of a young Greta Gerwig, a young Leslie Headland, a young Sean Christensen, and so on and so forth, and then Stone Cold Steve Austin, which was a funny situation because we had such a sort of a two-headed dragon in terms of the client list with Steve and his business versus this very cool, hip, up-and-coming, New York-based client list of filmmakers. So it was a blast. We had a good time, but that's how I got started in the business.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And I mean, there's a lot of I can always connect with, and because I grew up, I guess, watching R-rated movies as well, which it was always kind of this weird. I don't know. It seemed different to me that there were other kids who didn't and had all these restrictions because it was like my parents were surprisingly okay with the violence and everything, but then, occasionally if there was a sex scene or something, my mom would cover my eyes, and that was,
right.
That's kind of that weird, so that's not okay. But watching, all of the the whatever horrific stuff is going on screen, that's perfectly fine.
That's exactly right. The funniest thing that happened to me though was my parents would let me watch anything. Yeah. But then for some reason when Lost Boys came out, that was the one movie I couldn't watch. And so of course, when it made its way on video, I ended up getting to see it, and it became one of my favorite movies.
Oh yeah.
And I wonder if if the forbidden fruit nature of that movie, for whatever reason, I think it was just the fact that the poster was so effective. It said sexy and sleek on the poster, and vampires party all day, party all night, sleep all day. And so I think it was just that was the one that freaked them out. And so, of course, it's one of my favorite movies.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, that happened to me with, oddly enough, it was animated. Heavy Metal was the one that... for some reason. But, yeah, and I mean, I actually kind of wanted to go before we continue on with certain things, because you mentioned it, of physical media. And I think kind of really talking about it and how this industry is changing, especially with what's been happening within this last year. I mean, I think my companies have kind of really, worked with, I guess, the new age, where you kind of see these different, where you have the studio system that is almost trying to hold. There's ones that are trying to hold on so tight to the very clear theatrical release and that format, and you're starting to see these shifts and see, well, is this working? And yes, we can go, it'd be nice to go back to the day of this point, but is there really ever that, did we pass that, I guess, that line of, well, we can never go back to what it was in whatever, 95 or not, during that period where.
It feels to me like physical media and even the movie theater experience in many ways is going to become more and more of a collector's item mentality, right? So we obviously, every city has that great record shop, that great comic book store that still remains, and you walk in and you feel, maybe even a video store in some cities, although that's Family Video just went out of business, and Vulcan Video in Austin, Texas, so it's basically gone. When you have that final when you have that final last stand business, so to speak, comic books, record stores, whatever. You can create these communities of collectors and so on. It's really important. It's really impressive. Certainly there's been groups on social media and things like that. And then, of course, you can always buy, movies from Amazon or the Criterion Collection and all the good work they're doing. But let me explain. Physical media is so important for two reasons. One, the streaming services do not have perpetual deals on these movies. Yeah. And so after a year or two, they could fade away and they might go back into the vault, so to speak, not in the way that Disney used to do it in order to preserve supply and demand, but more because of just sheer laziness and not, people not thinking, or the executives just not putting the movie out again. And so there could be movies that disappear for a year or two at a time. And if you want to watch that movie, you're SOL. So it's important because if you want the ability to watch something at a certain amount of time, especially the older stuff, you're just not going to be able to find all of it on iTunes at the time you want to rent it or buy it. The second problem is obviously censorship, which is creeping in more and more every day as the world, goes haywire and as the big corporations start to sort of whitewash any of the projects that are now all of a sudden problematic. So, for example, I bought the entire season or the entire series of 30 Rock and the entire series of Little Britain because I know that moving forward, if they release those shows, they're going to get rid of all of the quote unquote problematic scenes. They already have. Yeah. And I love those shows, and I think comedy is able to push boundaries in a way that some people just aren't comfortable with, and that's okay. And so they're going to live in their Puritan worldviews, and I'm going to enjoy the scenes, on my Blu-ray. So those are why it's so important. But can you imagine? I mean, we made a movie called Dragged Across Concrete a couple of years ago, and obviously they don't have the contractual ability to edit the movie without our blessing. But could you imagine if they did? 10 years from now, that Don Johnson scene with Mel Gibson and Vince Vaughn, that scene doesn't exist. The thought police would come for that scene and they would cut it, and they would proudly cut it because they don't think it should exist. And so this is truly 1984 type stuff, and I'm a proud part of the resistance, so to speak. So we'll see how far and successful companies like mine can be, but we're in the fight, and we're happy to be in it. And physical media is a great way to sort of keep a copy of the original text, so to speak, before it gets bastardized.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can completely agree on that, and that's been some of the trouble that we've had on this podcast, because the other kind of section of the podcast, we talk about obscure films, and most of them are, you have obscure film from, the 1980s or 70s or even the 90s that are just completely, like, there's nowhere to find them at all, and we, are very adamant that, okay, well, we're not going to go and pirate these because we want to support the filmmakers, we want to support whoever, but we're just finding it's getting harder and harder for certain movies to actually be able to view them and really show them to the to present them in the way that we think we should.
Well, and that's why we have to support companies like Shout Factory and Scream Factory, their horror label, and also Arrow Video and Severin and Synapse and all these great companies that, Vinegar Syndrome, who are finding these really obscure titles and not only putting them out, but also restoring them with amazing artwork and steel cases and, really interesting behind the scenes extras and stuff like that. I mean, those titles just aren't going to appeal to the Criterion Collection for obvious reasons, but they're just as important. And so I own a ton of those titles from those different distributors, and I think that they play an important role in sort of the historical celebration and record keeping of movies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that kind of goes into something I really want to talk about, is especially with, Dragged Across Concrete and your Run, Hide, Fight, which just came out, and even the standoff at Sparrow Creek. All of these have elements where you're dealing with these kind of shades of gray, where there's not, a very clear black and white in terms of, the hero and the villain that we are starting to become more and more accustomed to, I think, because of, comic book movies or whatever it may be.
Sure.
But, there is kind of this, there's, as we've talked about before, recording, this notion that I was brought up with, especially in terms of learning this, was the idea of, if you want to make something political, that it should always be story first. You should never strive for, putting a political message in. That, will obviously be there because every, movie or piece of art is a product of its time, and you may have something that you're saying through your voice, but, and you've been very adamant about, telling a good story first. But even some of those movies that I just listed, those three, have very kind of, I guess, triggering elements that,
sure,
become political in a way with, a lot of people.
I think that first and foremost, I create an opportunity, I call it the sandbox, for the filmmaker to make their movie with as little input and outside pressure as possible. So the way I do that is I keep the budgets really low. I do as many pre-sales, which basically means I sell the rights to the distribution of the movie in the UK and Japan, and even in the US and Canada, most of the time up front. So I get people excited about the idea of the movie. They certainly know my track record, and so they'll give me a contract that I know once I deliver them the movie, they will pay me. And so I'm able to keep the budgets really low, but that allows me to turn over the creative process and the controls to the filmmaker. And so you'll see, in the case of Craig Zoller, Henry Dunham, Kyle Rankin, the writers and directors of those movies that you've mentioned, all of which those three guys are very different, but they all deserve a creative process that puts them at the forefront, right? Mm-hmm. Even though there are major actors on set, those actors are there to trust the process with the director and know that they're in good hands. So really, I seek a singular vision from the director, and I think that's what I've been successful with. And even in the case of some of the other movies that I made that are under the Fangoria banner, whether it's with Joe Begas or Chelsea Stardust or whatever, those are their movies. Yeah. Certainly I give notes and I give my opinions, and I have very strong opinions, but at the end of the day, they're contractually able to turn to me and say, F off. I like the way it is. And they've done that before. And I enjoy that moment because I know that they're standing behind the movie in a big way. So that's the first thing. In terms of the sort of the movies themselves and what it means for me, I am definitely attracted to the gray zone, as you say. I think that in this world, if we were all so black and white in terms of our decision making and our personal politics and in our our businesses and families and everything like that, I think the world would be very boring. Yeah. And so I really am attracted to stories of complicated individuals, challenging material, stuff like that, because I just don't get that from the mainstream Hollywood. I just don't see that as an audience member enough to satisfy me. So I'm actually creating the movies that I wish I could see as a audience member.
Yeah.
So that's where it's coming from. It's not coming from a place of my own personal politics. It's not coming from a place of me trying to push any agenda, because I don't have one. It's only coming from a place of adoring these creators and giving them enough room to create the thing that they intended to create within the boundaries of the budget and the schedule, which obviously have to be put in place because of financial restrictions. So I'm really proud of my system. You know, it's weird. It gets me in as much trouble as it does, sending me accolades.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to change. I love the way I operate, and we're having a lot of fun, and we're certainly having a lot of success.
Yeah, no, and that's great. I was kind of curious, I guess, getting to some of the logistics, because a lot of times when I've always had this appreciation for all involved, but of course when many are doing interviews or whatever it may be, there's always this look at the director itself. And I know you were talking about finding funding and all of these, like, really creating this sandbox for these filmmakers and setting it up for them. But for people listening, I think the idea of a producer is kind of like, we have this mentality from the movies that we've seen where you have a very character-esque look of, oh, that's the producer, cigar chomping, whatever it may be.
Sure.
So what does a kind of a producer, especially in the indie world, really do in terms of the very nitty-gritty and getting your hands dirty, which, I mean, you do a little bit more than one at a studio level, which is,
you can really break producers down almost into four categories. The first is a line producer, who is the person in charge of the budget, the accounting on set, things like that, making sure we're on time. On financial, on budget. So that's the first part. The second part is a physical on-set producer. On my movies, that's been a woman named Amanda Presmick, who has been a great partner of mine. She handles everything on set, the day-to-day. So I don't have to show up on set at 6 a.m. and I don't have to stay till 4 in the morning. She's in charge, and she makes sure we're shooting the scenes and things like that, and I can come and go in order to be there on the important scenes when my input's going to be needed, whether it's a big action scene or an important gore gag or a really important sort of story beat, which we just need to land implicitly. But I can also leave set and go back to the office and work on the next project and the next project and take interviews and things like that. So I'm kind of the third version of the producer, which is the person who sets it all up, is the figurehead, handles the lead roles of casting and financing and, picking the script and choosing the director, things like that. And then passing basically the project over to a person like Amanda to end up executing. And then the fourth type of producer is an executive producer, and that can take many different shades. I mean, it can be a person who put money in the movie. It can be a person in Hollywood who was the person who introduced the script to the director, or this or that. It can take so many different forms. So I really excel in my lane. I am not the person that can, sort of be on set every second of the day. It's not in my nature, and it's not using my talents to the best of the time. But there are lots of different kinds of producers, and they're all really, really important. Touching on a little bit of what you were saying earlier, the collaborative spirit of making a movie it's very real. Making movies is a collaboration, certainly. The actors, the producers, the director, the cinematographer. I think Darren Moran on Run, Hide, Fight deserves huge accolades for his work as the DP on that movie. I think he killed it. And I think Kyle and myself and so many of the actors, relied on him to really sort of deliver these amazing visuals. So it is a collaborative effort. That said, at the end of the day, someone has to be the boss.
Yeah.
Someone has to be the decision maker. Someone has to be able to tell everyone, nope, we're doing it this way. When it comes to the financials, that's me. When it comes to the creative, that's the director. And I think it's the best system. Certainly it's my favorite system because it's my system.
Yeah.
I didn't create the system. It's more of a system that came out of, filmmaking in the past, decades ago, before the corporatization of Hollywood and things like that. But I'm really proud of it, and I think, eventually someone has to be the boss because that's how you force the movies to be great. And I won't do anything I won't do anything that will hurt the quality of the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a code and it's a commitment, and that's really important to me.
Okay. No, and that makes complete sense, and I think it kind of brings up a lot of interesting kind of topics, and even pushing forward with the state of the industry itself, which we touched on a little bit ago, but kind of this mentality of really figuring out. I've heard so many differences over the years of people basically saying, well, at some point, the way we're going right now, where you have these ultra low budget versus $100 million and really no in between, and it's cutting out the middle class, I guess, of filmmaking, as it would be said, or just in general from economic perspective. But like really this notion of people keep saying, well, at some point it's going to change. At some point, they're going to go into the route that you're really taking of, like, it'll just be down to the creatives again. But then, like, it seems like it progressively gets more and more towards, the fact that Disney they bought Fox, and they, these companies are doing their own streaming service, and it's, kind of really setting up this. It's an interesting time to see what's going to happen in the next 10 years, I would say.
I would say that you're correct, and I would theorize that if you made a top 10 list for everyone in the world, especially sort of the traditional American audience members, men and women, I think for people your age to my age through our parents' age, if you looked at their top 10 movies, I would say 2 or 3 of them are probably huge, juggernaut movies that, we all grew up on, Terminator 2, whatever. Then you would have 1 or 2 on the list that would be really obscure, tiny films. The rest of them, the majority of them, 6, 7, whatever, however many left, would mostly be middle-sized movies.
Yeah.
Movies that were sort of, sleeper hits when they came out. I mean, look at John Carpenter's The Thing.
Yeah.
That movie bombed in theaters, wasn't well received, and is now arguably the most revered horror film. In many cases, I don't know how to exactly encapsulate that, but basically, it's one of the most revered horror films, and certainly a lot of people's favorite.
Yeah.
And that movie would be made now as a $1 million movie with, you'd never see the snow because, you'd have one shot of CGI snow at the beginning of the movie, and then they would be inside like Sparrow Creek for the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
So, there's real dangers to the middle class dropping out. I mean, I would say that would apply to almost every conversation. Politics, socioeconomic status, all kinds of stuff. The way you see the world. The middle tends to be the most appropriate and the safest spot. So I think it's a bummer. I applaud companies like Solstice Studios that put out the Russell Crowe Unhinged movie. I saw it in theaters a couple months ago. I really enjoyed it, but I was the only person in the movie theater, one of one. And the movie, struggled, and they've since had to lay a bunch of people off. So it's a hard business, and that's probably a lot of the reason why I've stayed in low budget, because I like to be able to, try and make our investors' money back as much as possible. We have a good track record of getting the movie investors the budget back, and so I think we don't want to blow anyone's mortgage payments or hurt their financial status, and so we stay in these low budget movies where we can be a little more risque with our subject matter, knowing that if we swing and miss, we still have a good chance of recouping the budget. We have on almost all. So that's an important thing to understand.
No, that makes perfect sense. And since I know our time is running short, I'll bring up, so I know you're a big fan. I haven't watched it yet, but I did order it on your recommendation as Year of the Dragon. So because I know that, again, what specifically about movies like that, I guess for just people to kind of get to know you, or if you have, as part of our podcast too, any recommendation of like obscure or independent films that you believe need to have kind of more eyes on them, that you really champion. We kind of always end with that recommendation. Sure. Yeah.
Well, I keep getting asked in these interviews during my Run Hide Fight press tour, what are your favorite movies? And I'll tell you the obvious stuff that everyone knows, but I keep bringing up Michael Cimino, and specifically The Year of the Dragon, because he is arguably the greatest filmmaker, in my opinion, that ever lived. I look at The Deer Hunter. I look at even his earlier movies, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and I just even Heaven's Gate, which is such a spectacular movie. People could argue whether it's a disaster. I think it's a masterpiece. Mm-hmm. And I think that even Michael Cimino at his worst is better than 99.9% of filmmakers. There are some movies that he made later on in his career that, just sort of didn't work for whatever reason. But Year of the Dragon is really special, and it's funny because people love The Departed, right? They love that movie. And I always tell them, if you love The Departed and you're willing to be challenged, check out Year of the Dragon, because it has a stellar Mickey Rourke before he started to kind of, evolve, we'll say. Yeah. And he's so sharp, and he's such a leading man, and the movie is so rough around the edges, and it's so brutal in its depictions of sort of race relationships and the cops engaging with local communities. I mean, it is, and then the relationship between him and his wife. I mean, it is brutal, and it's so unflinching. And so I think that most audiences today wouldn't be able to handle that movie. They would find it to be transgressive, or they would find it to be too rough, or too brutal, or too problematic, to use everyone's favorite word on Twitter. And I think you got to be challenged. Safe spaces aren't a thing, that I'm supportive of. And I would encourage people to watch a movie like that and understand, like, this is how the world operated back then. And there's no rose-colored lens placed over what these big cities were like back then. And so I just think it's such a fascinating take. But also even beyond Cimino, look at all the great movies that Dino De Laurentiis was making outside of the system. I mean, we can argue over David Lynch's Dune, but I call it a masterpiece. I think it's just amazing. And De Laurentiis was kind of in many ways operating out of the system in the same way I was, but then selling back into the system. And certainly his budgets were much bigger than mine. And I'm still in my head, I'm just getting started. But you got to look to these people who were really willing to work on the edges of the entertainment industry, frankly, at the sacrifice of their own careers. I mean, if Michael Cimino had been more of a team player, he would probably have made some of the biggest movies of the 80s in the studio system. And maybe that's correct about me. Maybe that's correct about Craig Zoller. Maybe that's correct about any of these terrific filmmakers that I've worked with. But they won't compromise, and I love that. And so my job is to find a way to get their movies made with as little compromise as humanly possible. And I think that, a movie like Year of the Dragon is uncompromising. And so I would encourage everyone to watch it simply because it exists in almost a different time period, certainly in reality, but also just emotionally, where you can make movies that aren't safe. And so I'm trying to make movies that aren't safe, and we'll continue to do so. And look, I'm really happy. Like, I've had a heck of a year. I've been attacked by my enemies. I've been challenged. I've had companies implode. COVID's been, ridiculous, a ridiculous challenge to movie productions as we all try to get back on sets and things like that. But I'm happy. I'm happier now than I ever have been in my career. I'm more bold. I'm more excited about the future. And I think you're going to see some terrific stuff coming out of our company. And if your audience is open to it, come follow us along. We're only on Instagram because Twitter is a cesspool of hell. And we're on Instagram at Bonfire Legend. That's the name of the new company. And we're gonna make a lot of great stuff. So come check us out.
Okay. Yeah, that was a lot of great information. It was a real pleasure to actually be able to talk to you and about all of it. So thank you for joining me today, Dallas.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Bloodhound Pix podcast is part of the Morbidly Beautiful podcast network. Produced by Josh Lee, Craig Drum, and Kyle Hintz. Music by Raymond Seed. Editing by Kyle Hintz.